All right, Jill, we're trying this out. We're at Franklin in room 325. Is this the case? This is where I'm at. I haven't been back on campus in a long time. All right, we're gonna do a review. So let's share screen. And now I wanna share this screen. And now I wanna share. And now I'm gonna pop that down. We're gonna pop this up. There we go. Okay. Let's start by going through the slides. I'm gonna go over a couple of points. I guess first, since you guys are in the room, and I don't see anybody else on here, do you guys have any questions about the causes of the war? Because I feel like we've gone into that a lot. How we got into the war? Yeah. I think, let's see. I kind of went over it, but we'll start from the beginning and then we'll see, right? So I think the thing is to think about are before World War I, you know, we had imperialism, we were kind of out there in the world. And then when World War I kind of emerges, you know, the United States wants to think it's isolationist, but in reality, it's like, it's just trying to remain neutral, but it's engaged in imperialism, it's engaged in trade, it's engaged in all of these things. Does that make sense? So we like to think of ourselves as neutral, but yet we're kind of engaged. I don't know if that makes sense, right? And so Wilson wants to kind of remain neutral, right? But, and like, he wants to remain neutral, but we are not I would say we're not isolationist because we have all of these other things that we're kind of doing, especially imperialism and trade, right? So when the war breaks out, and this isn't like world history, so you don't have to know like all about like the alliances and everything else. I think the main thing to remember is just that like, you know, there's militarism, there's alliances, there's imperialism, there's nationalism, and there's an assassination. This is called like mania. It's like, if Diego Gonzalez heard me saying this, he would say, this is really Molly, you know, would you bet your life on it? And I would not, but this is like the kind of easy way to remember the causes. And if you look at the list, the US is involved in militarism, imperialism, nationalism, but we do not really care because we're not in an alliance, right? So we don't really care when Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. We're not taking sides. Does that make sense? So for a long time, Wilson wants to be neutral. So in 1914, Wilson is basically saying we need to be neutral in thought as well as action, right? So he's telling the US this is what we need to do. And so as the United States, as the countries are lining up, the United States is trying to remain neutral. But the thing we're trying to do is trade, right? And the problem is that as the war goes on, right, we are trading way more with England than we are with Germany. And there's a really simple reason, which is that England is blockading Germany, right? So England has a huge navy and they're stopping us from trading with Germany, which is why Germany turns to U-boats, right? So Germany essentially turns to U-boats because they have no other option, right? There's a blockade. Hey,
good morning.
Good morning. There's a blockade and there is, right? And so they sink the Lusitania. They claim there was munitions on it. They even did give notice like, hey, if you get on this ship, we may sink you, right? Because they saw submarine warfare as like necessary. I don't know if that makes sense because the English had their navy and they couldn't trade. The Lusitania and like unrestricted submarine warfare is usually one of the main causes. They try to quit it, but over time they have to do it again because they're kind of like continually losing. So that is probably the biggest cause. And when you read it in speeches, usually what he's saying is like, what Wilson claims, like even if he doesn't say the word unrestricted submarine warfare, what he'll say is like, we need freedom of the seas, or we need, usually like freedom to trade, freedom of the seas, freedom to be neutral. Does this make sense? So if you read that in a speech, what he's actually talking about is like not getting sunk as we're trying to trade or travel. And then the other thing was like the Zimmerman telegram, which was essentially Germany. We had a lot of conflict with Mexico, and Germany sends a note to Mexico essentially saying, if the US declares war on Germany, and then Germany will support Mexico if they attack the US to distract us from Germany. I don't know if that makes sense. And then they could get all those lands back. So this combination leads to the declaration of war, like a number of years after it officially starts. The most famous quote is this, like, make the world safe for democracy, which is like the next part of the kind of lecture, which is like, the other hallmark of World War I is how repressive it was in civil liberties in the United States, and how like women were using this quote of like making the world safe for democracy because at home we weren't really doing it. Does this make sense? So one of the short answer is going to be propaganda. I'm going to give you a piece of propaganda, and the question is going to be, what is the I think I have it on that review. What does it say specifically? I think it says, what is the purpose? Yeah, how does it try to achieve the purpose? And yeah, and what does this reveal about the problems of World War I? Okay, so if I gave you like this one, right? What is its purpose? What is it trying to do? And when you're looking at the purpose, look at what it's actually trying to do. What are they trying to get people to do? Can you speak up a little bit? To ration? Yeah. Yeah. So they're trying to tell people to ration, right? Eat less wheat. What's different about World War I than World War II is in World War II, we're going to get actual like ration stamps, right? Where it's like, you can only eat this much wheat. In World War I, they just appeal to people to eat less. So they would have things like meatless Mondays or wheatless Wednesdays, or I don't know. Does that make sense? And actually prohibition, there's two reasons why people think prohibition passed during World War I. One is like anti-German sentiment, because if you look at like Budweiser, and like all these beers, all these German beers, right? People were like, no drinking. But the other thing is people passed it as like a war measure, because if people are drinking less, then all that can go towards the war effort. So prohibition and women's rights are kind of weirdly tied to World War I. But yeah, eat less wheat. So the point is to get people to consume less or contribute on the home front to the war effort. Yeah. And then how do they do it? How are they getting people to want to not eat wheat to support the war effort? Yeah, so then you can think about your propaganda techniques. Defeat the Kaiser and his U-boats. So then you can think about, yeah, like fear. It's really dark. I don't know. They always kind of over exaggerate these kind of like features and stuff. He looks very demonic, right? I guess bandwagon, I don't know. Anyway. And then what does this reveal about the problems of the time or the issues that are surrounding World War I? What one would you say is kind of in this picture? The first one, I guess, and the second one. The who? The Maine is Spanish-American War. What's the one in World War I? There's always a ship getting sunk. We have the Maine, we have all this one. This one in World War I is the Lusitania, all right? Yeah. Yeah, so you could bring in the Lusitania as like a part of that short answer, because it shows like the sinking of the ships. You could even just say like unrestricted submarine warfare. Does that make sense? So yeah. This is horrible, but when you get into the EOC, a lot of times they put in a lot of propaganda. It's one of the favorite things they like to give you. Now, how do you know World War I propaganda from World War II propaganda? Anyone? How do you know bad Germans in World War I versus bad Germans in World War II? This is the way I remember it. World War I, they have like the little pointy hats. It's like World War I, pointy hats. So if you see those like weird pointy hats, those are World War I, Prussian army, Germans. I never understand why they have the pointy hats. It's a thing. Bad Germans. All right. And I guess the other thing you could look at with like, why do we have so much propaganda in World War I is the fact that people were so afraid of, like, because we had so many Germans in America. It was the #1 language spoken in America at the time. And there's like papers. People started calling these folks hyphenated Americans. And during this time, people are like, you're no longer a German American, you're an American, right? Like, and Germans kind of voluntarily were like, we're not German anymore, right? They stopped printing their papers. They stopped going to like their societies, you know, having their gymnastics clubs and stuff. So yeah, yeah. And I did kind of go into this, but I feel like I was really kind of all over the place. In New Orleans, there was 40,000. I mean, today it's like Oktoberfest, or it used to be. Oh, so sad. I was just thinking today, I have not gone to Oktoberfest. They just got their building. Anyway. But there's like a long-standing history of Germans in New Orleans, and they've had like their clubs, they had, you know, gymnastics, they had their kindergartens, they had their paper, right? And so during World War I, and then they had like Berlin Street, which actually wasn't even named for a German, it was named for like when the French defeated whatever. Anyway, but then when World War I comes down, there's no more papers, you know, they stop going to the clubs. They change Berlin Street and they make it illegal to teach German in Louisiana. So, I don't know. I feel like Frau Becker is here. She could probably tell you more about this, but anyway. So propaganda, right? That is what you're going to look again. Like this one, what are they trying to do? Do you guys know what bonds are? Liberty bonds? Yeah, it's essentially a loan from the people to the government, right? So I would buy a bond. It's usually not very high interest, but you get a little bit back. So like, I would give the government $1,000 now, and then say over the next, after the war is over, the next 10 years, I don't know, you would get a slight amount of interest, like, I don't know, over time. So the government can use the money when they need it and then pay you back with a little bit of interest later. So are the Liberty bonds like specifically like during the war? Yeah, they're issued during a war to support the war effort. So it's like asking the people to loan you money, the government money, and then they with a promise to pay it back later. The only problem with like war bonds is like if your side loses. So like in the Civil War, a lot of Confederates had like war bonds to the Confederacy, but then when the Confederacy failed, right, they're never going to get that money back. But like the U.S. government has consistently paid on their bonds. So this one is obviously to finance the war, to get people to buy the bonds. And again, what are they using? Yeah, it's propaganda, so they're using fear, right? You can just even identify the emotion they're appealing to, right? Are they appealing to patriotism or bandwagon or fear? You don't have to remember all of those techniques, but like, what are they appealing? What's the emotional appeal, you know? And this one is obviously fear because he's got like the bloody hands. Also, it's weird because they call Germans Huns. It's a really weird racialization of Germans in a weird way, where they are like, in like a lot of this propaganda, they make it like, I don't know, like they're never like white, right? They're always like their faces are blackened. And then they call them Huns, like they're no longer Anglos anymore or whatever. So they're like, it comes back to, I guess, the Kaiser said, we will beat back, I know, we're going to like wipe across Europe like the Huns in some speech. And then now that we always call them a Hun, but there's obvious other reasons why we call them Huns, but they're not really Huns. They're not like, you know, Asiatic folks. So then the committee who's actually publishing it is called the Creel Committee, also called CPI. So it's like the government creating propaganda to get people to do something, right? And so the other thing we're doing to try to unify the nation is the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. We'll probably go over that more next time, but essentially making it illegal to speak out against the government. And so Eugene Debs up here, he's the guy who got arrested under the Sedition Act. And yeah, he is going to run for president in jail. You know, he's a communist socialist who, you know, gets arrested for speaking out against the draft. And yeah, anyway, it's an interesting story. I like this quote. He says, I would have rather 1,000 times be a free soul in jail than to be a sycophant and coward in the streets. They may put these boys in jail and some of the rest of us in jail, but they cannot put the socialist movement in jail. So anyway. Shank is kind of the, what do you call it, precedent that kind of a lot of this stuff is. And so this is the famous line where they say, you do have freedom of speech, but it only goes so far. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater. So if something is a clear and present danger, you don't have a right to do it, right? And so the way I remember this is, you know what a shank is in jail? It's like it's an improvised knife. You're so innocent. You know, a shank. So it'd be like if you take a toothbrush and you make a knife out of it, you shank somebody. Anyway, lesson learned is a shank. It's like an improvised knife that you make out of something else, usually in jail. Yeah, if you make it out of like a, I don't know, I can only think of a toothbrush. It's called a shank. And anyway, if you see a shank, it's a clear and present danger. That's the way I remember it. It's not actually spelled like that, but anyway. So the clear and present danger test with shank just means if something presents a danger, you don't have a right to do it. And then they deemed, and literally all he was doing was handing out these flyers that say, long live the Constitution of the United States, and that the draft was wrong. He gets arrested on sedition. And the Supreme Court holds it up and they say, yeah, it's okay, because you were endangering the nation. So, and then Debs kind of goes down like that too. Women are working, which helps to pass the 19th Amendment. A lot of protests are actually also, right, kind of pointing out the hypocrisy, which we'll look at in a minute. But when the president gives his address, he says it's because women support the war effort. So that's what he claims, even though a lot of people think it is this like radical in the street stuff. African Americans fight in segregated units. We're going to talk more about this when we get into the next part. And as with every war they fight in, people hope that it leads to more rights. And then labor unions kind of cease and desist sort of during the war. But then you do have Debs, who's kind of acting against the war, and he's seen as like kind of a radical. All right, the Great Migration we'll go into as well, but a lot of folks are moving north for jobs in World War I. It's kind of the beginning of people moving from the south to the north. And the, you know, major way people are fighting is trench warfare. It's horrible, I can't imagine it, but this one is actually nice because it's not filled with water, but often it's like these things are just huge ditches that are like filled with water and rats. And you get trench foot because your foot is just essentially never dry. And then like, yeah, I don't know, we could see if we can watch a video, but people kind of run across the field and then, I don't know. So like over here, you're gonna have like artillery, right? Oh, let's see. So you're gonna have big guns. The reason why there's a no man's land, if you think about like physics, there's like a certain range that like the big guns can go. Does that make sense? And so essentially you have one trench at the end of that range. Does that make sense? And then they have like the big guns, and then there's another trench at the end of that range. So it's kind of just on the edge of where you could get shelled by these huge, big guns. And then you like, so like as soon as you like get out of your trench, it's like huge shells, right? Then you run across, trying not to get hit by a huge shell. Then as you get closer to the trench, they put up barbed wire and then like machine guns. So then you have to jump over the barbed wire, not get machine gun. And then if you're lucky and you get to the other guy's trench, you can like bayonet them and like stabby stab. And then, but it's like there's a series of trenches. So then those guys retreat into the next trench, and then they come over and then they push you back. And like literally these things just like don't change. The US does sort of like help put more, you know, it's like they kind of push because they come later and they're fresh and they're not like been shell shocked for years. They do kind of push the war, you know, because these lines have been drawn for a long time. This is a good example of like, they call it the 1,000-yard stare, right? Like shell shock, because if you're just sitting there with constant shelling all the time, no rest, it's a problem. There is the beginning of tanks, and mustard gas is one of the big things during the war. People try to like throw it into the trenches, and this is one of the things I think people fear the most. You have the beginning of airplanes, but they're more for like reconnaissance, you know, and maybe some dropping of mustard gas or something, but they're not like what they're going to be in World War II. Yeah, fun times. So it's a horrible war, right? Obviously. And the US kind of comes in at the end of it, but Wilson is a progressive in like foreign policy. He believes in like cooperation. He believes that like people can work together to make a better world. That's kind of, I mean, you can be, and it's right to be very critical of his racial policies, but what makes him the most progressive is his foreign policy outlook. And essentially, it comes down to your view of human nature. Do you think that people can cooperate? Does that make sense? Like, do you think that in the world, do you think the world is anarchy, like every man for himself, like stabby, like only the strong survive, right? That's one kind of foreign policy, is might makes right. And the other foreign policy is we can make norms and work together, which is like a more cooperative idea. And Wilson is of the latter, right? He believes nations can work together. He believes we can create institutions to kind of prevent war for the future, right? And so when he steps into the room at the end of the war, he is like, I pledge to make the world safe for democracy. Let's do it, right? And let's make this a lasting peace. So he comes up with an idea of 14 points, and then England and France are like, no, right? We have been fighting this war for years. You know, millions of people died. This is terrible. We're going to make Germany pay. So they kind of reject. So like the Allies reject Wilson, and yeah. But then the one thing he does get is the League of Nations. So essentially, we set up punishment for Germany. We don't accept most of his ideas as in the treaty, but the one thing he gets is a League of Nations, which is essentially like a UN where people can cooperate and stop war. This is called Article 10, or, you know, that's a Roman numeral 10. So that is the League of Nations. So in France, when he's negotiating, the one thing he gets is the League of Nations, and he brings it home, and the Senate hates it, right? The Senate is like, we don't want to be involved in a organization that like ties everything together. Does that make sense, right? We don't want to be involved in what they saw as an alliance. So when he brings it home, the Senate does not pass it. So when you read like a lot of like the issues is like the Senate does not like the treaty. They don't like the League of Nations, and the president wants to pass it. Anyway. So that is that. So the U.S. doesn't even does not agree to the thing, and yeah, we sort of return to normalcy. We try to return to isolationism after the war. So that's the kind of overview. Let's look at the questions. So this one we've seen 100 times. I also see it on the EOC like all the time. Again, Kaiser means the German leader, right? And I think that's the key to this. What is she doing? Yes, criticizing Wilson. Very good. Yeah. A lot of these women, a lot of the radical feminists, like this isn't Alice Paul, but a lot of them were actually pacifists. Some of the progressives were too. But this isn't what they're doing right there. All of the following are true except, yeah, C, or whatever this one is. Wilson repealed the Sedition Act. Good. So this is an example of propaganda, and it would be recruitment, right? Enlist means recruitment. It's just like definitional. So you could use like any of these for like your purpose. Does that make sense in a short answer? Like conservation of resources, you know, unification of the country, financing the war effort. Any of those would be like things you could use as your short answer. Does that make sense? This one specifically is recruitment of soldiers. Yeah, conservation. I think technically conservation is a better term for World War I, just because they're not mandating it. Like it's not like a state mandated rationing system. But I don't think it's technically wrong either. Anyway, but yeah, that would be conservation of resources. I don't think rationing is wrong. This point of view most likely contributed to, yeah, I think I fell into the trap where I made everything C. I see. It's the old standard. If you can't remember, guess C. Yes, it's true. And then Henry Cabot Lodge, he opposes A. I did switch it up on one. 14 points. Yeah. And so there you kind of see an example of like the Senate opposing the president. So, I don't know. I guess. I'm trying to figure out what's better than. I feel like my two. Oh, there it goes. Okay. All right. So I guess that's it. For the most part, we could maybe watch something. There's a good drunk history about. It actually kind of ties in with some of this stuff, but they don't need to watch it. All right. See you guys later.